friends, it's time for me to film my August 2023 reading recap wrap up, whatever you want to call it. I want to talk about all the books that I read in the month of August, which is also my birthday month, and I did do some really good reading, so I'm excited to talk about the books today. If you see me glancing this way, it's because I'm looking at the notes that I have because it's a couple of months after August. I've had a pretty busy time from August up until now, and this is the first time I've actually been able to sit down again and film these longer videos as opposed to the vlogs, which are a little bit easier because I do them on the fly. So bear with me, but let's get started. So the first book that I read in the month of August was actually a real treat, and I'm so glad that my friend Kristen picked it out for me to read, and that book is Legends and Lattes, which is by Travis Baldree. This is the Fairy Loot edition, which has the holographic foiling, and I honestly don't know how that's coming across on camera, but it is a very pretty edition. Anyway, this book is about an orc named Viv who decides she's tired of battle and adventures and settles down in the city of Thun to open up her own coffee shop. It's exactly what it says on the tin. High fantasy, low stakes, good company. The high fantasy is really mostly to do with the different races you encounter and also the history that sort of follows Viv into her new home. But I really enjoyed this. It was heartwarming and heartfelt. I loved the coziness of seeing Viv settle into her place in this new town and finding friends and companionship along the way. Also, just as someone who loves coffee and pastries, that entire aspect of it was so much fun to read. And it was just cozy and charming and a wonderful, wonderfully heartwarming way to start up the month. So I'm really glad that I read this first. I then followed that up by reading the buddy read that we had chosen for the month with Danica. I think this was for August. Anyway, the book was The Keeper of Night by Kylie Lee Baker, which I had been meaning to read for a very long time. The main character, Ren, is a half British Reaper, half Japanese Shinigami, and she flees from London to Japan, but in order to find a place for herself there, especially in the Japanese underworld, she ends up being sent on a quest or given a task to eliminate 3 very powerful, very dangerous yokai demons. It was a lot darker than I anticipated. There's definitely more a horror vibe, which makes sense given that, it's Shinigami and you're dealing with the underworld and demons and all of that stuff. But I was actually pleasantly surprised by this story. It's got all of the trappings of your typical fantasy slash, I guess, shonen shoujo anime, where, she's dealing with these supernatural creatures and going on these quests and looking for these clues, finding unlikely allies, making some enemies, all of that fun stuff. And there's a lot of action there, which I really enjoyed. But I also really liked just getting to know the character of Ren, just seeing her struggle sort of with her identity, who she is, what she's meant to be, where she's meant to be, or what she's meant to be doing. And I also was pleasantly surprised by how the plot twisted and turned. There were indeed some things that I could kind of guess at just based on, being very familiar with the fantasy genre, especially in YA, and also just being familiar with how some animes are structured as well. But there were definitely some things that happened that I was not anticipating at all. I do intend to finish the series. There's only one more book. I believe it's called The Empress of Time, so I'm hoping to get to that one as well. The next one is also technically a buddy read that I did with Danica, and that is The Husky and His White Cat Shizun Volume 1. I forget who the author is right now, but you'll probably see it on the screen because I'm going to have to flick the cover on there anyway. This is about a guy who became emperor after killing his way to the throne. He's kind of a tyrant, but he's still super dissatisfied, and so he ends up taking his own life. And then he wakes up reincarnated in the body of his younger self, and he decides that he's going to change things in order to change where he gets to at the end of his story. The thing with this is that it was my first experience with danmei, and I did not realize until I was partway into it that it was a darker danmei. There are definitely content warnings and trigger warnings for this one, so please look them up before you pick it up. There were elements of this that were entertaining to me. I always enjoy the setup of learning about a world with some interesting lore, and if it has familiar touchstones, that always makes it more fun for me to encounter as well. I didn't necessarily like the characters. Sometimes I was really just frustrated, especially our main character, Moran. He is so frustrating. He makes me so angry a lot of the time, but I also kind of understood his perspective at times. There were moments that, he displayed some vulnerability or some emotion that I found relatable, so there's that. I haven't decided if I'm continuing on with that series, but I do think I would like to try more danmei, so maybe that is in my future. All right, the next book on this list is The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry, which is by Gabrielle Zevin, and I decided I wanted to read more of her work after picking up Tomorrow, and loving that one. And this book in particular is about A.J. Fikry, and his life is kind of changed kind of turned on its head when a baby is left in his bookstore, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I was pleasantly surprised by this one. It gave me the same sort of feelings as A Man Called Ova by Frederick Bachman, even though I like that book more. I am always interested in contemporary stories that are very character driven like this, where you know that the character has been through something and is still reeling from that something, but then something unexpected occurs in their lives and they're sort of forced to confront those feelings or to really parse them and deal with them. And that's always interesting. I love the idea that, and I believe in it really a lot, that, you know, anyone you encounter or things that happen to you in your life ultimately change who you are as a person, whether it's in the way you choose to react or in the way that, you know, you gain a new friend or you lose someone. And I think that is the greatest strength of the storied life of A.J. Fikry. I also really like that there is a bookstore book aspect to this, that was sort of part of the main plot as well, and that was interesting. I know I didn't love this one as much as I love Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, but it was still really compelling, and it was also a very quick read, so I'm glad I picked it up. Then I read a book that I have been highly anticipating, and that book is The Hurricane Wars, which is by Thea Guanzon. And this is the first book in, I think it's a duology, but it could be a trilogy. Anyway, this is the beautiful Fairy Loot edition. Like, I am obsessed with how they did this cover. The Hurricane Wars is about two characters, Taliesin and Alaric, and they're on the opposite side of the Hurricane Wars. But a greater threat appears and threatens everything, and they're forced to team up in an unlikely alliance in order to eliminate said threat. Well, the things I enjoyed about this one were the plot. I thought it was fun. The setting I thought was fun as well, and I loved all the nods to Southeast Asia and the Philippines in particular. Like, they were subtle, but they were there, and that was really interesting. There's definitely room for this one to be even more expansive in terms of the world and the details in it, and that's always enjoyable. Plus, I'm generally a sucker for like light magic and dark magic, and that's definitely, if you couldn't tell by the cover, a big aspect in this book. I don't think I was as invested as other people might have been in the relationship, which is definitely a key component of this story. I wanted to be, but I think I just didn't connect as deeply as I would have wanted to either of our main characters, Taliesin or Alaric, and I also just didn't necessarily feel like I could jump on board their romance. I'm curious to see how this story is going to go on, though, because of the way that this ends. I don't know what's going to happen in book 2, or at least I really have no clue how this is going to come to its conclusion. So we're going to have to wait and see. But yeah, I've read The Hurricane Wars. The next book is a contemporary romance, and that is Off to the Races, which is by Elsie Silver. I am obsessed with this watercolor cover edition. This is the first book in the Gold Rush Ranch series. It's about a horse trainer named Billy. She's the new trainer at Gold Rush, and the minute she meets her new boss Vaughn, sparks fly between them. Even though they tend to be a little bit antagonistic towards one another, it's undeniable that there's a pull between them, but will their history get in the way of that? And this is my first Elsie Silver, and it was so good. Like, First of all, the most important thing you need to know is that I am a literature horse girl. Like, I have read books. I grew up reading books about horses and horseback riding and stables and all of that, and I've always loved it. And just to be able to read a romance that has that sort of vibe, chef's kiss, so good. And I know this is Elsie Silver's, I think it might be her first or one of her earliest pieces of work, and you can kind of tell just based on how she develops the relationship on page, how the writing is in it. I still thought it was pretty good. Like, I enjoyed the dynamic. Like, she did a really good job bringing the two main characters, who are the couple, to life and giving them each a backstory that really informs who they are as a person. I liked seeing them grow and change, not just because of their relationship with each other, but, you know, through the course of events in the book. And like the whole side plot with the ranch and everything, so good. Like, it was just so fun. And I'm definitely looking forward to completing the series. I am just enjoying it so thoroughly, and I have no doubt I'll enjoy Elsie's other work as well. I read the conclusion to a series, and that is The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden. I buddy read this one with Kristen. This is the beautiful Fairy Loot edition. Anyway, this is the third and final book, so that means it is building on the plot that was growing from the very first book in the series. This series finale basically brings back our main character Vasha, as well as Morosco, and they're involved in the final battle against mortal and magical enemies in order to save Russia. And just like the first two, I think Catherine Arden has a way with writing. There's just something about her narrative style and her word choices and the way she portrays things that feels so fairy tale-esque and whimsical, but also still very grounded in modernity. I don't know how to explain it, but that's how it feels to me. I really enjoyed seeing the outcome of Vasha's story. She's come so far from who she was in the very first book of this series and who she is here in The Winter of the Witch. Whew, so good. And I feel like we got pretty satisfying conclusions to most things. I won't say that this is my favorite in the series. I still think that honor probably goes to the first or the second, which I love equally. But I do feel like Catherine Arden managed to tie up all those ends and bring them together and give us a conclusion that was really satisfying to read. So definitely love this trilogy and would highly recommend. It's also perfect for reading like in autumn, winter. I feel like that's the vibe, so definitely check it out. The next book I read was sort of a prequel. It is part of the same world, and you could technically consider it part of the series, but it is a standalone that could stand on its own. And that's Her Radiant Curse, which is by Elizabeth Lim. This is about Chani, and she's determined to defend her sister Vanna against all of these suitors who seek her hand. And then she ends up involved in more than she bargained for. There's a war, there's a quest, and she has a budding romance. Chani is a character you meet in another book of Elizabeth Lim's. This book in and of itself is more about her love for her sister and how that drives every choice she makes, every action she takes, every step, every move you make. Anyway, it drives Chani to make the choices she does and to do the things she does. And I thought it was a pretty good standalone. It has the same signature hallmarks as Elizabeth's other work. There is magic, there's mayhem, there's some banter and shenanigans, and the lore itself ties in really well with the rest of what we know of this world and these characters. I do think like the third act action and the climax and everything, it happened really, really fast. And I feel like that was a little too rushed in my opinion. Like personally, I still enjoyed it, but not nearly as much as I've enjoyed the other books in this world. The next two books are tied together because they're part of the same series, technically, and that's Tales from the Cafe and Before Your Memory Fades, which are both by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. They usually tie together about 4 stories about these different customers who go into a cafe where you can travel in time for the length of a cup of coffee. So this one takes place in this exact same cafe as the first one. And I liked it. I still found it to be compelling, especially because, again, I'm very much a sucker for a slice of life stories. I like learning about people, what makes them the people they are when you meet them, and, you know, where they go from there, especially after their encounters at the cafe. I don't think the emotional impact of this one was quite as strong as the first book was, especially upon a reread, but I still thought it was pretty good. This book, however, was such a surprise. So this book takes place in a cafe with a similar background, except that it's not in Tokyo. It's a different cafe, which means new staff and also new people coming in. And I don't know if it was just the timing of when I read it, but I found myself particularly moved by the stories in this book, like almost brought to tears. And maybe it's because I felt like I could personally connect with some more of the stories in this one, just like I did with the first. So this was really, really good. And I'm looking forward to reading the newest one that just came out this year. Next, we have One Dark Window, which is by Rachel Gillig. This is about Elspeth, and ever since she fell ill as a child, she's actually had a monster in her head that she's nicknamed the Nightmare. It's a being that protects her and helps her, but comes at the cost of her slowly losing herself to this being. Eventually, she finds herself running into some unexpected allies, and in a bid to help find a cure for herself and for the dark magic infecting the rest of the kingdom, she might have to let the Nightmare help her and these people gain what they're searching for, which is an entire deck of Providence cards. And I was really surprised by how entertaining I found that one, although I do think it feels more YA than adult, although it's published as adult. I like the lore in it, especially. I think the whole idea of Providence cards and the dark magic and how to cure it is really interesting. And I like how the author played around with that. I also thought the characters that come together for this sort of mission that they're on were an interesting bunch. I was obviously very biased and really liked Raven, who is a character that is the one who brings Elspeth into the group, and he's also a captain of the guard. Like, those are all like tropes I enjoy. So it was fun to like read the whole mission of them gathering the story, to see like the twists and turns, the successes and the failures along the way. And I thought it was really entertaining. Like, I had a good time reading that book, and I definitely, once I hit the ending, I was like, oh, I'm gonna have to keep going on with this series. And luckily the sequel came out a few months later, which is not too far off. So that was a good time, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. Next, I read The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Yes, I read The Secret History. Can you believe that? I've even tabbed it a little bit, and it's kind of hard to see because they're like peach colored tabs. Anyway, so this is a dark academia, I guess you could say classic in that genre. It's about 6 classmates who are studying under a very charismatic, very eccentric professor. They look at classics and translations from Greek, and they definitely find themselves viewing their lives and existence in an entirely new light, even as their, morality and the question of good and evil comes up. The thing that most people know about this book is that there is a murder, someone dies, and they're sort of dwelling on how we got to that point and how we got past that. One, I was really surprised by how easy this was to read. I was always worried that it would be too dense for me and require too much thought, but it is slow going in that there's so many words on a page. Like, that is how small the writing is. And every time I thought I had read a lot of it, I really hadn't. But every time I picked it up, I didn't have a hard time slipping back into the story or understanding, what was going on. I was hoping to see more thematic concepts on page, but then I realized they're more implied in terms of what is happening in the story. This one centers heavily on Greek tragedies, and, it kind of mirrors that story in the plot in a sense. So I thought it was interesting as a character study just to see where these characters were going, how they got there, what would happen next. Like, I could hardly put it down. I actually read it way faster than I thought I would, and I consider it a great accomplishment given that this book has intimidated me for so long. I still like If We Were Villains better, but that's because I'm biased and I really like Shakespearean stuff. But I do think The Secret History is really interesting. It's a book that I felt like I thought about a lot while I was reading it, and I actually would read it again just to revisit and to see what I might have missed in the earlier pages, knowing what I know now about how it ends. It's so funny because you can kind of see how abruptly my tabs stop. I just realized this now while I was flipping through it. But anyway, I read The Secret History. If you want to see more, you could probably watch the blog where I talked about it, which I'll link. How many more books? 1, 2, 3. Oh, we're down to my last 3. Okay, so then I read Darkwater Daughter, which is by H.M. Long. It's the first book in a new series, and it's about a storm singer and a pirate hunter who join forces against a deathless pirate lord. And if you think that sounds like a rip-roaring fun adventure, it is. It's also got some pretty dark moments, I'm not gonna lie to you. I was not expecting that when I read it, but I had an overall good time with it. It's rare for me these days to read very seafaring pirate type stories that I really like, and this is one of the few where I'm like, yeah, that was a really good story, and I look forward to seeing what happens next. I will say, as a plot in one book, it actually resolves itself quite well, and you could pretend that there was only one book if you didn't want to keep going on with the series, but it was good. I thought it was interesting. Like, I liked the lore and how she put that all together. I thought the 2 main characters were fun to follow, and just to discover more about them as the story went on was really intriguing to me, and she did it in a very natural, organic way. So I had a good time with that one as well. Okay, the last 2 books of the month I also really enjoyed. First is Half a Soul, which is by Olivia Atwater, which I had seen floating around the interwebs for some time. This is also a Fairy Loot edition, in case you were wondering why the cover is blue and not green. This is about Theodora. She was cursed by a fairy as a child, and that means she only possesses half a soul. When she goes to London for the season alongside her cousin, she ends up crossing paths with a very powerful magician, the Lord Sorcier, and winds up entangled in political and fairy affairs. And I really liked it. It's like Regency romance, but with fairies, and I love historical romance, especially of that era, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the tie to fairy. I enjoyed the light touch of fantasy woven into a romance, woven into this historical setting. It was fun, and I think sometimes that's all I want. I read this with my cousins and my sister for our family book club, and I really just enjoy that we're now getting a variety of fairy stories. I think that's something that I really appreciate, and that this is different from a lot of the ones I'd read recently was a plus in its favor for sure. I can see why everyone raves about it, and while I'm not necessarily one of those people who would say this is an all-time new favorite and I'm obsessed with it, I do think it's very good, and I highly recommend checking it out. And last but not least, one of my favorite things that I've read this year, aka a book I should have listened to my friend DJ and read way earlier, but I'm glad I read it now, and that is The Undertaking of Hart and Mercy by Megan Bannon. This book was so good. It made me cry. Like, that is how I know that I love a book sometimes, because I'm like, if you can get me invested enough, especially if it's a romance, if you can get me invested enough in the main couple and their circumstances to make me cry at some point, whether it's happy crying or sad crying, it's a mark in its favor. Anyway, this book is about Hart and Mercy. They're constantly butting heads, especially in their respective jobs as a marshal, which is Hart, and an undertaker, which is Mercy. They have to work together, but they don't necessarily like that. They don't know that they're also forming a different relationship where they confide in each other using letters that are anonymously written to a friend, and it kind of goes from there. And the things that I liked about this one, well, I already said it. I really enjoyed Hart and I really enjoyed Mercy. Both of them are very strong-willed, funny, sort of smart people, but they have some shitty circumstances and history that they're dealing with. Like, you can't help but feel for them. And then you have the fact that there's that sort of spark between them. It kind of looks like they're antagonistic, and they really are. I think it's more a misunderstanding than anything else. But you can also tell that because of the letters and how they confide in each other, there's something else brewing between them, and it's so lovely to watch that friendship and romance blossom. I also really like the non-romance plot. Like, I like the stuff that was part of that as well, which I thought was really clever. And I think the combination of all that in one book, just having the non-romance plot be good, and then having the romance be good, and then having these two characters that I could root for and love, chef's kiss, was so good, and I enjoyed myself so thoroughly. Definitely would recommend checking out The Undertaking of Hart and Mercy, and I'm super, super, super excited for the next one. There's dragons in the next one, which I'm very excited about. But yeah, The Undertaking of Hart and Mercy was a hit for me. I know it probably won't work for everyone else, but for me, so good, so good. Those are all the books that I read in August. As you can probably tell, I had a pretty great reading month, and I'm super excited to finally be able to talk about all these books. If you've read any of them, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you haven't, tell me which one you're excited to read just based on hearing me talk about it. And I will see you guys with a new video soon. Bye!